Want to see how I make perfect circles just like this? I've got a table saw jig that makes it super quick and easy and gives you perfect results every time. So I made this jig quite a while ago to cut out circles, and it's worked really well for how simple it is. You simply start with a piece of plywood, and it can be any size. I have this one that is roughly 20 inches long, and basically you make this little skid on the bottom of it that fits into the track on your table saw, and you make this setup kind of like a zero clearance. So initially, this piece of plywood was a little bit longer, and then I ran it on this sled straight through my table saw so that this line right here matches up right on the edge of my saw blade. Then I went ahead and pre-measured some radiuses, and you can see I've got 4, 8, and then I go 12, 14, 16, and so on. And I have a few custom sizes in here, but most of my circles I make are between 16 and 20 inches. And I just had a little straight edge here and pre-drilled a bunch of holes. And then I actually take a nail and I cut the nail in half, and that's what I use as my peg to go inside of the plywood and then in the bottom side of the piece of lumber I'm cutting into a circle. I also want to mention that I wax everything, especially the bottom side of this plywood and this skid here, with paste wax, as well as the table saw, the top of the table saw, and that allows this to slide freely so that you can make cuts much more easily and it doesn't get stuck. So right here is the panel that I just glued up. I jointed this all off camera. It's kind of that same milling process that you'll see with every project. And look at the figure on this walnut. I can't wait to see that after I get some oil on it. But I'll pull all the clamps out of this, and then I'm gonna find my center point by measuring from one edge and dividing that by half, and then from another edge and dividing it by half. And where those 2 points intersect is gonna be the center of this board. And that's where I'm gonna pre-drill a hole that goes halfway through the thickness of these walnut planks, and that's where that peg is going to sit. I look at both sides of the panel, and I've determined what my top is going to be, because obviously that little hole is going to be permanent, and I don't want that to show on the top of the board. So I look at both sides and determine which one I like the best, and the one that I like the least is going to be the bottom, and that's where I drill that hole. So here I've got a nail, and these fit perfectly in these holes here. And I use a fencing pliers to cut this down. This is a pretty heavy, I don't know what gauge nail this is. I just have a box of these randomly. But it's a pretty hefty nail to cut with like a side cutters. But if you have a good one, you can definitely cut it with the side cutters if you don't have a fencing pliers. These are made for a little bit heavier gauge cutting, so that's what I use. And I'm just gonna cut this to be about 3/4 of an inch. So here's my peg after I've cut it. It's at about 3/4 of an inch, and it just fits right inside here. And then obviously I'll drill a hole in the top or the bottom of my board that I'm gonna cut into a circle. And then I just set the plank right on top of here. So here I have my center point. Right there, you see that X, and then I put a little bit of blue tape on my drill bit so I don't go too far. Once you've gotten to this point, it would be pretty awful to accidentally drill all the way through your project. Again, this is the bottom side or the uglier side of the board that you're working with, and I'm going to drill this hole for that peg to sit in. Okay, so I have this walnut panel here on the peg on top of my jig. It is kind of tricky to get it to rest on top of that nail. I use a flashlight so I can see down in there to get it all lined up. And this is about as big of a circle as I would cut with this jig. And this is going to be a 23-inch diameter circle. Usually I do about 18 inches or so, but I bought these planks of walnut and they were pre-cut to this length already in kind of a scrap bin at my local hardwood dealer. And it would be kind of foolish to waste, you know, that 2 or 3 inches in diameter with just scrap wood. So I'm gonna make the biggest circle I can with these panels, and that came out to be 23 inches. The first thing that I do is I cut off the corners. So I'm gonna run this corner through this direction and then do the same for the remaining 3 corners. And then after that, I just keep pivoting this panel here and cutting off large corners. And as I go, those corners get smaller and smaller. And in the end, you're able to actually just spin this freely onto the blade and it'll give you a perfect circle. So first thing you're going to see me do is remove the riving knife. You cannot use that to cut circles on this jig. And then I'm going to just cut off these large corners of this panel to begin with, just to remove some of the weight and bulk of this circle. And notice how I'm standing off to the side of the blade, just in case you ever had one of them scrap pieces catch the blade and go flying. The safest thing to do is stand over to the side so that it just shoots it right past you. I'm also shutting off the blade after each cut, especially on these larger corners that I cut off to start this circle. Now, as I move along with this process and the corners start getting smaller and smaller, I'll leave the blade on and make multiple cuts and then shut the blade off to remove some of the scrap material that has built up over time. But when you first start off, I highly recommend you just shut the blade off after every pass. It's the safest way to do this. Here you'll see me pick up the pace a little bit. And as soon as I get a little bit too much bulk on top of the table saw here, I'll shut off the blade and then remove all of that excess lumber, just so I don't risk shooting any of that across the shop. And once you have all of that bulk removed, you can start to spin the circle onto the blade. Now I am extra cautious and I remove as much bulk as I can, so there's hardly anything left before I start spinning it on the blade. And I take a couple passes on it, and then you'll see here a nice clean cut circle. Off camera, I took my round over bit with my router and I ran that through both edges to remove that sharp edge on both sides of the circle, and it leaves you with a really nice clean finish. And to oil this, I'm using Howard's cutting board oil. I use this one and walrus oil on a regular basis. I like both of them equally. This is just what I had on hand. So I'm going to spread this around, let it sit, and then I'm going to actually add more to it after about an hour or so, because I want that walnut to soak up as much of this oil as possible. Then I flip the board over and I do the same thing on the other side, and then I actually set it on its edge to dry evenly on both sides. This will help prevent any warping from uneven drying.
Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video on how I make my table saw jig to make these awesome round charcuterie boards. I really appreciate you watching, and I hope that you like and subscribe to my channel. We'll see you on the next build.